Voilà, je pense qu'il est l'heure de commencer. Bonsoir à tous, good evening, dobrý večer, puisque nous sommes avec des amis tchèques ce soir. Et c'est un grand plaisir pour moi, bien sûr, de modérer cette conférence en présence de M. Michael Żantowski, qui a été le porte-parole de la présidence de la République à l'époque du président Havel, qui a aussi été ambassadeur dans plusieurs grands États où il a représenté la République tchèque, les États-Unis, Israël, la Grande-Bretagne. Il a été formé comme un psychologue à l'époque des années 70, voilà. Puis ensuite, il est devenu traducteur. C'était, m'a-t-on dit un jour, à l'époque de la normalisation, une façon d'avoir une certaine indépendance. Voilà. Et bien sûr, ensuite, vous avez été actif dans le Forum civique, ce qui vous a permis de rejoindre le président Havel, et vous avez écrit cette superbe biographie, je dois dire. Je l'ai acheté la semaine dernière à Prague et je l'ai lu d'une traite. Je l'ai commencé dans l'avion et en 4 jours je l'ai fini parce que je l'ai trouvée vraiment passionnante. Et je dirais, le risque quand on a été un proche comme cela d'une personnalité, c'est des fois de céder un peu dans la géographie, ce que vous ne faites jamais. Vous avez vraiment un recul très très subtil par rapport aux personnages que vous avez servis, et ça ne rajoute, je dirais, que de la qualité à votre travail. À ma gauche, Jacques Rupnik. Est-ce que je dois le présenter en détail? Grand spécialiste de l'Europe centrale, ami, collègue du CERI ici à Sciences Po, qui fut aussi l'ami de Václav Havel et son conseiller dans les premières années de la présidence de la Tchécoslovaquie, puis de la République tchèque démocratique après les changements de 90. Voilà, mais avant cela, c'est mon plaisir aussi de vous présenter Son Excellence Monsieur Michal Fleischmann, qui est l'ambassadeur de la République tchèque en France. Et je vais lui laisser la parole, car je crois que Monsieur l'ambassadeur souhaite adresser quelques mots avant la conférence. Monsieur l'ambassadeur, vous avez la parole. Bienvenue.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Le Ken. Merci tout d'abord d'accueillir ici à Sciences Po cette conférence. Merci pour les centres culturels tchèques d'avoir permis de faire venir Monsieur Żantowski. D'ailleurs, ça sera poursuivi l'année prochaine. Je crois qu'il a 21 pays que tu vas visiter.
21.
Donc là, c'est bien que ce soit à Paris. Demain, il va à Londres. S'il n'y a pas la grève. Donc, je suis vraiment très heureux de pouvoir l'ouvrir ici à Sciences Po. C'est très important de sortir un tout petit peu du milieu de l'ambassade et d'aller vers vous et nous adresser directement à vous. Je pense qu'il est important de signaler dès le début que la présidence tchèque du Conseil de l'Union européenne, que nous vivons actuellement, a été mise sous la tutelle, ou si vous voulez, sous le slogan d'un discours repris dans un discours de Václav Havel à Aix-la-Chapelle en 96, l'Europe, une mission. Et comme je sais que cette idée d'utiliser ce slogan et de revenir vers Václav Havel est l'idée de Michael Żantowski, je lui laisserai développer ce sujet-là à lui tout seul, je ne vais pas le développer moi-même. Mais en tout cas, ce slogan, c'est ce qui décrit notre présidence du Conseil de l'Union européenne. Bon, qu'est-ce que ça montre? Tout d'abord, cela montre une continuité. Depuis la révolution de velours, la République tchèque est restée toujours liée à l'idée de l'Europe et s'est engagée pleinement dans cette mission. dans cette situation actuelle de la guerre en Ukraine et la conduite éhontée de la Russie, la présidence tchèque a vraiment focalisé toute sa présidence sur la question ukrainienne et sur les questions qui sont bien sûr liées à l'Ukraine, soit la crise énergétique, les diverses crises que ça accompagne. C'est un conflit européen, c'est un conflit mondial. Il faut s'en rendre compte, nous sommes en guerre, en Ukraine, on se bat pour nous. Václav Havel disait que le problème de la Russie, c'est qu'elle ne sait pas où elle commence et où elle finit. Je pense que ce conflit, cette situation actuelle, devrait pouvoir nous permettre de finir avec cette question, d'en finir, et d'expliquer aux Russes où ils commencent et où ils finissent. Il disait aussi dans son discours, si je me souviens bien, à l'ONU, il disait, si vous voulez nous aider, aidez la Russie. Force est de dire que l'Occident l'a suivi et a énormément investi en Russie, a envoyé vraiment, les entreprises se sont installées et ont fait augmenter le niveau de vie des Russes. Force aussi est de constater que ça n'a pas marché. La situation actuelle le montre. Même si on apporte aux Russes tout ce qu'ils veulent, ils s'opposent quand même à l'Occident. Vous savez pourquoi? Parce que tout simplement, ils ne veulent pas être à l'Occident. C'est vraiment le plus grand problème. Maintenant, nous sommes dans un milieu universitaire, donc je vais renvoyer les étudiants à des livres pour qu'ils étudient un tout petit peu. Je vous demande, pour que vous avanciez dans vos sciences politiques, de relire von Clausewitz quand il dit que la guerre n'est qu'une diplomatie par d'autres moyens. Il avait de l'humour. Relisez de Koustine quand il disait qu'en Russie, le moindre mot vrai est considéré comme un attentat contre la sécurité de l'État. Relisez Ernest Renan et sa définition ce qu'est une nation. Pour lui, la nation n'est pas formulée par une langue, ni même par une ethnie, mais par une volonté de faire de grandes choses ensemble pour l'avenir. Vous verrez, en lisant tout cela, que pas grand-chose a changé dans l'esprit des dirigeants russes, depuis le XVIIe jusqu'à aujourd'hui. Sans faire d'anachronisme, vous verrez que rien n'a bougé et qu'il y a une constante, celle de l'impérialisme russe, celle d'une slavophilie sous l'égide de la Russie toute seule. Nous, les Tchèques, on n'existe pas pour les Russes. Nous sommes des Slaves, donc nous sommes des Russes. Václav Havel savait tout cela, et je suis très heureux qu'on revienne vers ses pensées, vers ses réflexions. À Prague, au château de Prague, se sont réunis il y a une dizaine de jours 44 présidents et chefs d'État pour débattre de l'Europe. C'est un débat nécessaire et je dirais vital. L'Europe, à Prague, a fait passer un message à la Russie quand même. Elle lui a montré l'avenir de la Russie, lui a donné l'architecture de l'Europe, lui a donné l'architecture de la future Europe, celle des 44 pays. 44 idées d'Europe, mais qui ont une constante en eux-mêmes, la démocratie, la liberté, la vérité, les droits de l'homme, l'état de droit, et je dirais surtout pas de nationalisme. Je pense que la réunion au château de Prague, de la communauté politique européenne, aurait plu dans cette formule-là à Václav Havel. Merci.
Merci beaucoup, monsieur l'ambassadeur. Voilà, maintenant je vais changer de langue. We're going to switch to English. And let me just remind you the general title of the conference, which is Europe Seen from the Center, so Europe Seen from Central Europe, the Legacies of Václav Havel in the reflection on Europe. Michal Zantowski, you are going to start this debate, and your presentation has a very simple title, Havel's Europe. So tell us in 20 minutes, please, what Havel's Europe was and what's the legacy of that. Mr. Zantowski, you have the floor.
Merci beaucoup, Excellence, Monsieur l'Ambassadeur, Professor Queston, Mesdames et Messieurs. That's it. I will have to start with apologies. The first is obviously for speaking English. I can speak some French, but I'm sure that you don't want to hear it. So please forgive me. The second apology is for using this contraption that should not stand in the way of intellectual discourse. But I have to explain. I'm a victim of child abuse in one real sense. I was born left-handed, and when I went to school in the 1950s, I already wrote with my left hand, and I became a victim of an effort to reteach me to write with my right hand. And in that way, I forgot to write with my left hand, and I can't write with my right hand. I'm completely dysgraphic. If it were not for this, and for a time, I was even proud to say that, I was a victim of the Stalinist regime. But then I learned that similar practices were employed in other countries of Europe that were not victims to communism. So the apologies are now out of the way. Europe, Havel's Europe, Europe according to Havel. It sounds very pompous, but and we have to keep in mind that nobody is indispensable, even Václav Havel. It is possible to imagine Europe without Václav Havel, but it would be a different Europe. Just moving around Europe these days, as our moderator said in his introduction, one keeps coming across reminders of his legacy. In Strasbourg last week, when we, the Václav Havel Library, awarded together with the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe the Václav Havel Human Rights Prize to the immensely brave Russian dissident Vladimir Karamurza, who is in prison in Moscow. We walked past the Václav Havel building of the European Parliament. On Thursday of last week, I was speaking at another Václav Havel European Dialogue in The Hague, near the Havel Place. The Havel Place is a technical term. It's an untypically modest historical monument consisting of a table and 2 chairs, and it is now installed in more than 50 cities and towns across the world. And on the way from The Hague here, I passed through Brussels with another Havel Place installed next to the building of the European Parliament in Leopoldspark in Brussels. And just a few months ago in June, I had the pleasure of unveiling a Václav Havel Place in the Jean Monnet House in Bazoches-sur-Guion, some 50 kilometers away, in the company of Roberta Metsola, the President of the European Parliament. And my friend, His Excellency the Ambassador, is telling me that soon we may also have a Havel Place in Paris. Well, mind you, having a monument is not a very reliable measure of a historical figure's worth or significance, just as on other continents, among the statues of great men, we find in Europe also statues of tyrants, of murderers, of megalomaniacs. And the modern thinking is that they should be all taken down and destroyed. But I think there is something to be said for keeping them around as mementos, together with the history they represented. Fortunately, Havel does not qualify in any of the above categories, so his symbolic legacy is safe. And, moreover, dismantling a table with two chairs would appear somewhat ridiculous as an act of historical justice. It wouldn't work. The Czech presidency in the Council of the European Union in the last 6 months, which we have taken after the French presidency in the first half of the year, is taking place under the Havel motto, Europe as a task. And the question we need to ask is then, what is this task Havel had in mind? How much or how little of it was accomplished? And in which ways it remains incomplete? Leaving aside with some regret Havel's theatrical work, which has become a part of the European theatrical canon, even before anyone has heard of Havel as a dissident or a political figure, and much of it is connected to Paris and France through figures like Samuel Beckett and Eugene Ionesco and other modernist playwrights of the 1950s and 1960s. His contribution to the European political thinking and history is simply put threefold. It consists, in my mind at least, of three aspects. The first, in insisting that consciousness precedes being and not the other way around, as the Marxists believe, as Havel said in his address to the US Congress, and insisting that every political act is a moral act. He once again brought back the moral question to the center of political universe. Together with people like Andrei Sakharov, Jan Patočka, Jacek Kuroň, Bronislav Geremek, and others, he had advocated the centrality of human rights and the defense as a universal political goal throughout the communist period. And he went to jail for that, for 5 years. After this principle became recognized in the 1975 final document of the Helsinki Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe, it became a formidable weapon, which finally helped to bring down the communist monolith in Central and Eastern Europe and opened the way for the reunification of Europe. Since it also elevated Havel to the position of a head of state, it enabled him to make it a core principle of the Czech foreign policy lasting to this day. It's one of the pillars of continuity the Czech foreign policy stands upon in spite of occasional attempts to disrupt it, and I believe it served us in good stead. All this while Havel knew that human rights are too important to rely on the state for their protection. This made him a tireless promoter and ally of the civil society, both home and abroad. The second aspect of Havel's legacy is his advocacy for the process of the European integration and his political work to achieve it. He advocated the European integration and the enlargement of the European Union with the newly liberated countries as a, quote, a unique attempt at a democratic union of states. And it was an ideal that Havel did not discover for himself, but it ran in his family for 3 generations. Even his grandfather was an early supporter of European integration and of some kind of a European federation. So when he became the president, he first initiated the process of regional cooperation in Central and Eastern Europe, the so-called Visegrad Group that I think Jacques will talk about at some length, and then started to campaign for the Czech membership in the European Union proper. And until his death, he defended the European Union against its critics and its enemies. But that being said, in his mind, the idea of integration went far beyond the present state of the Union. In the largely theological debate that the older among you may remember about the deepening versus the enlarging of the European Union, which was very popular 15 years ago, he was squarely on the side of the enlargement, arguing that you cannot have a Europe which is half prosperous, peaceful, and democratic, and another half which is struggling with prosperity, peace, and democracy, just as you cannot have heating in one half of a room and not to have it in the other half of the room. As we now know, Europe went largely the other way in favor of the ever closer union, which, among other things, also made further enlargement even more difficult to achieve. And I regret to say it happened without making the union much closer. You know, those of us who remember the heyday of the common European defense and security and foreign policy in the first decade of this century, the initiatives like the Mediterranean Union, the European Neighborhood Initiative, the Eastern Neighborhood Initiative, and so on, are sometimes asking our colleagues in Brussels what happened to them, and the answer is apparently not much. Sometimes it seems things have gone the other way. Since 2007, when Bulgaria and Romania joined, only one country, Croatia, joined in the 15 years in between. And the Western Balkans, where the process got stuck, is still a festering wound of poverty, crime, hatred, and a promising ground for Russian interference in their domestic affairs. So for Havel, the ever closer union, important as it is, was not a top priority. He said, and I will quote, "I do not perceive the European Union as a monstrous superstate in which the autonomy of all the various nations, states, ethnic groups, cultures, and regions of Europe would gradually be dissolved. On the contrary, I see it as the systematic creation of a space that allows the autonomous components of Europe to develop freely and in their own way in an environment of lasting security and mutually beneficial cooperation based on principles of democracy, respect for human rights, civil society, and an open market economy." Unquote. So for him, Europe was not a set of rules and directives, which he often ridiculed, but primarily these principles of democracy, respect for human rights, civil society, and an open market economy. The sad connection, or the sad contribution, which is connected to the other two, that particularly stands out at this time, was Havel's contribution to the European security. It is, I think, symptomatic of Havel's political genius that someone who has often been thought of as more of an idealist and thinker than a practical politician has done so much to make his country and his continent a safer place. He was one of the early supporters of the German reunification, when many European politicians were still hesitating, because he felt that without the German reunification, it would be impossible to build a new European political and security architecture. He said in his address to the Polish Sejm, that you cannot have a united Europe without a united Germany, just as you cannot have a united Germany without a united Europe. He was also a firm advocate of the transatlantic link, without which he felt the security of Europe could not be successfully maintained. And unfortunately, this thinking of his and other thinking was subjected to a very serious test in the first half of the 1990s with the war in former Yugoslavia, which, as you will remember, at first the EU attempted to resolve by itself, believing that they can introduce enough soft power and enough peace observers to establish some kind of a truth, but that didn't happen. Havel was instrumental in persuading President Clinton that the United States had to be involved militarily in the international effort to stop the bloodshed in Yugoslavia and consequently in the drive to enlarge the North Atlantic Alliance, NATO. And he was prescient, based on his and his nation's long experience with the despotism of the Russian variety, in seeing the threat from the East when most other European politicians still saw Putin as someone to do business with. Already in 2008, it will be 15 years, he said, and I will quote, "The Putin era has brought a new type of dictatorship, all the more dangerous for its inconspicuous mask. It is remarkable in that it weds the West of communism with the West of capitalism." You know, the mafia capitalism idea that is so brilliantly implemented in Russia. And based on the experience of the Munich Agreement and the Munich trauma, a central trauma in the 20th century Czech and Slovak history, he was adamant about not appeasing the Russian dictator in the face of threats and blackmail. In a speech in 1993, 20 years ago, as the war in former Yugoslavia was raging on, he said, and I quote, "As people who once became the victims of a shameful concession to a bully in Munich, we must know even better than others that there must not be concessions made to evil, even when it is not committed directly against us. Our indifference toward others can, after all, result in only one thing: the indifference of others towards us," unquote. And if anything can be called the Havel doctrine in the realm of foreign policy, so this is it. This is the Havel doctrine. And he would be glad to know that his warnings were finally heeded, if somewhat belatedly. However, Havel's thinking on Europe went even beyond the practical considerations of political integration and security. In the speech from which the motto "Europe as a Task" is taken on the occasion of the awarding of the Charlemagne Prize in Aachen in 1996, he mused on Europe in its ancient meaning of the twilight, and suggested that its novel task might not any longer be to teach the world how to do things better, more efficiently, or more progressively, but show by its own example how to live more modestly and more responsibly. In his own words, I quote, "Europe's task is no longer, nor will it ever be again, to rule the world, to disseminate by force its own concepts of welfare and what is good, to impose its own culture upon the world, or to instruct. The only meaningful task for the Europe of the next century is to be the best that it can be. We shall do most for the world if we simply do as we are bidden by our conscience, that is, if we act as we believe everyone should act." Or As he famously put it in his speech to the US Congress, the salvation of this human world lies nowhere else than in the human heart, in the human power to reflect, in human meekness, and in human responsibility. Without a global revolution in the sphere of human consciousness, nothing will change for the better in the sphere of our being as humans, and the catastrophe toward which this world is headed, be it ecological, social, demographic, or a general breakdown of civilization, will be unavoidable." Unquote. This task, if it is a task for Europe, is still far from being accomplished. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Żantowski, for this very inspiring speech. And now Jacques is going to do what academics love to do, to revisit, right? So you're going to revisit Havel's legacies, and you call it From Visegrad to the European Political Community, the new one. So Jacques, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And great pleasure to be here with Michał Żantowski. We are both, well, familiar with the character we are talking about, but also, I think, trying to make sense of his legacies without being simply exegete, repeating what he says, sometimes seeing to what extent what he had to say may be relevant or not to our situation today. So, yes, Havel's became the symbol of the post-89 trajectory of East Central Europe towards EU integration, the return to Europe as it was. And we are now today in a completely different situation. People talk about change of paradigm, Zeitenwende. This is a new era. The Russian war in Ukraine creating a new, entirely new situation, an entirely new predicament. So do some of the Havelian insights, how do they fare in this situation? Well, first of all, I would say, although Havel was the symbol of this post-89 era, he never bought the idea of the end of history or the European exit of history. Michael Żantowski just mentioned, the Balkans, the war in Yugoslavia. I was then head of the International Commission on the Balkans, and we visited Havel, and he was very strongly engaged. He understood that the question, the breakup of Yugoslavia, that the nationalist conflicts in that region, ethnic cleansing, as it was called then, this was a warning for Europe as a whole. And so basically, if one had to sum up his view, it was, if we don't have a Europeanization of the Balkans, we could one day have a Balkanization of Europe. This is, as he told me in an interview, this was a process of communicating vessels. This is Europe, des vases communicants, as you would say in French. So that was first thing. And the second observation would be about Ukraine. After the Orange Revolution, that is 2004, I made an interview which was published in Le Monde with him. And I asked him, do you see a parallel between what is happening in Kiev today and Prague, November 1989? And he said, well, there are parallels because people gather on the main square every night, and they do it every night, and they wait until the government goes away. So in that respect, there is a parallel. However, there is a big difference. Our revolution was a revolution against communism. This, Ukrainian, is a revolution against post-communism. So I asked, well, what is post-communism? He said it's a mixture of an authoritarian regime and mafia capitalism. So he was already, engaged. So, although he was, so to speak, the symbol of this triumphant post-89 era, he was well aware of some of the problems that we were going to face. I don't have much time. I will briefly mention three issues which have to do with his thinking about Europe and which have some relevance to our situation today. One concerns nation and identity in the Czech case, but of course this is a much broader issue, as you understand. One about Central Europe and its contribution to European integration, the Visegrad Group, if you want, and thirdly the enlargement question and the prospect of a European political community. So briefly, yes, Michael Žantovský said there was a continuity in Czech foreign policy with its, let's say, concern for human rights. Yes, on the whole, that is very much true. But in terms of the domestic political debate about Europe and the articulation between nation and Europe, which is, of course, was dominant in the post-89 period, I would say there were at least two main poles, the two Václavs, if you want. There was Václav Klaus and there was Václav Havel. And the first one had a kind of Thatcherian view of what Europe should stand for, and basically, and his memorable sentence, are we going to let our identity and our sovereignty to dissolve in Europe like a lump of sugar in a cup of coffee? That was supposed to be the warning. And Havel was answering, I don't get it. I don't understand where is the problem. Europe as a threat to our identity or something like that. He said, I'm from Prague, I'm Czech, I'm European. These are three dimensions of the same identity, three complementary dimensions. And, have you heard of a Portuguese saying that he's concerned that his identity will dissolve in the European Union? He says, no, this is silly, and we should resist this kind of identity politics that was there. But I'm mentioning it simply because it was not such a smooth ride, and he was of course, he was extremely influential, and the only reason I'm mentioning it for today is that his voice is missing. I don't hear on the Czech political scene. There are people, of course, who are interested in trying to combine the two. But a voice with such force and clarity and conviction which could convey the European prospect in the way he did. And fortunately, this doesn't lead to some of the regression we see elsewhere, but that is, let's say, something that is lacking today. The second issue is Central Europe. January 1990. Okay, he's been elected at the end of December. January, less than a month after, he's in the Polish Parliament, the Polish Sejm, and there he says. He already outlines the vision about Central Europe. We should not compete with each other to gain admission into the various European organizations. On the contrary, we should assist each other in the same spirit of solidarity with which in darker days you protested against our persecution and we protested against yours. In other words, build on the solidarity that the dissidents have built in the pre-1989 era. Secondly, for the first, I'm still quoting him, for the first time in history, we have a real opportunity to fill the great political vacuum that appeared in Central Europe after the collapse of the Habsburg Empire with something genuinely meaningful. So there you have, not just solidarity from the period, no, there is a geopolitical vacuum which is not just left by the end of the Soviet Empire, but which he traces back to the end of the Habsburg Empire. And we have to fill it with something meaningful. what that something meaningful could be. Of course, European integration is our goal, as the previous quote mentioned. But in the meantime, we should have Central European cooperation. And this is where you get three former dissidents, Václav Havel, Lech Walesa, Arpad Göns, the Hungarian president, three former dissidents, founding together the Visegrad Group at the beginning of 1991, and more or less in the spirit of what I've just quoted from Havel. This was not the only proposal on the table at the time. There was a proposal by the Italian foreign minister, De Michelis, called the Pentagonale, where he wanted initially 5 countries. And then, of course, people said, yeah, but you don't have Poland among the 5. Oh, okay, so let's make hexagonale and so on. And so it went that by the year 2000, the Central European Initiative, as it was rebranded, had 16 members. And when Macedonia joined, I asked Václav Havel, is this still Central Europe? And he replied by saying, there are institutions that perish out of excessive politeness. And I then said, do you think that may apply to the European Union? He said, cannot be ruled out. Okay, that was more than 20 years ago, but that explains why he thought the Visegrad Group should remain a smaller, not overly institutionalized endeavor. If you start out of excessive politeness, and expanding is, you've lost track of the main purpose, which doesn't mean that you cannot ad hoc cooperate with others, of course. And, in Litomyšl in 1994, yes, Visegrad presidents met, the 4. By then Czechoslovakia had separated, so you had 4, not just 3. But they invited, there was a Slovenian president, there was Austrian president, and there was a German president, von Weizsäcker. And I will spare you a memorable scene where I asked the Hungarian president to define Central Europe, and he messed up. But anyway, if we have time in the discussion, I will return to that memorable scene. But there you have Visegrad plus. You can ad hoc have. And I then thought, this is interesting, because that means Visegrad leaning westward. If you have Austria and Germany, 2 members of the EU, you are basically thinking of Visegrad, Central Europe leaning westward. That's what it meant. That's how I read what that meant. Now, to cut a long story short, what we've seen in recent years is Visegrad turned upside down with the endeavors of Mr. Orbán and Mr. Kaczynski and their parties and the evolution. I will not go in depth into it, but the idea of illiberal democracy and the radical Euroscepticism that they both promote obviously runs contrary to the initial purpose of Visegrad, as I mentioned it in the quote at the beginning. I mean, when you hear from a Polish Minister of Justice or from the Hungarian Minister of Justice that EU conditionality about the rule of law is the equivalent of, that means Brussels is behaves equivalently as Moscow did. Brussels is the new Moscow. Well, try to tell that in Kiev. Because in the meantime, you have the Ukrainian President Zelensky making a speech to the European Parliament on the 1st of April and saying, this is where we want to be. These are the values we espouse. This is where we want to be, a country with democracy, rule of law, etc., and not with the autocracy of the Russian type that is now waging a war on us. So that's Visegrad turned upside down, and then you have Visegrad imploding, more or less, with Poland being on the Ukrainian side and Hungary being much closer to Putin in this war. So we have we have a sort of the initial project badly battered, but the Central European idea, as Havel put it, I mean, I said that his view was Central Europe leaning west for obvious purposes. Now with the Ukrainian war, I would add Central Europe is becoming attractive to Ukraine in a wartime situation. This is the main support, and this is the most immediate West they can identify with. I mean, if you say West and you are in Ukraine, well, the most obvious West is the countries of Central Europe. So in this sense, you could say the Central European engagement in the Ukrainian cause and Ukraine looking to Central Europe as the nearest West, you have, I would say, Central Europe enlarged to the West. How far remains to be seen. Havel, we don't know, but Havel had observations about the borders. Ukraine means, you know, this is where the border is. This is, and he saw it as borders of civilization. He says, I or nobody else can define where that border will be in the future. These borders are never fixed definitively. However, the one thing we can say, it should be Ukraine's choice where they want to belong. So that is a crucial thing. He said there is a divide, yes, and I can see it, and it's a very old one, historical, religious, what have you, etc. But it is up to the Ukrainians to choose which way they want to be anchored, which values they want to espouse, and this war is also about that. Now, precisely the final point about Europe between values and institutions. It is in Paris that Havel made a speech, his federalist speech, in the French Senate, where he openly called, long before Joschka Fischer, about a European constitution and federalism, etc. So he pronounced the F word. And I will not go into that, but I want to simply say he did not ignore the institution. But his main take was that you have, if you're thinking about Europe, there is the geographical definition, he says. That's one thing. Then you have the institutional definition, and that's what I just said, the European Union. And then you have what he calls Europe as a common destiny. And that is about values. That is about democratic values. And he says it has fuzzy borders, back to what I just said about Ukraine. You know, the borders of that Europe of values can evolve, of course. Now, I think where Havel is interesting in the current debate about those values, and I'm going to simplify and perhaps slightly caricature the positions, but let's say we have one group who says Europe is democracy based on the rule of law, it's a normative power, and it's basically a rule of law, legal norms and institutions. Okay. And to take it to the, let's say, more elaborate position, this is Habermas, constitutional patriotism. This is what Europe should stand for. I mean, there is one version with Ulrich Beck, the German philosopher and sociologist, who says, what is Europe? What is he called? It's a substantial void and complete openness. Well, you know, it's not easy to identify with substantial void. So that's one extreme. And that last quote suggests that I'm caricaturing it. Okay, even if you take that part away, Europe only based rule of law, norms, 100,000 pages of acquis communautaire, that is, yes, very important, but as I say, not easy to identify with. Then you have the opposite version, the one we hear from Orban, Kaczynski, and others saying, no, European values, this is the family, the nation, the church. And this is basically what Europe should stand for. This is a conservative definition of what European values should be, and Europe, i.e. the European institutions, shouldn't meddle in, in our definition and implementation and legal, sometimes, extension of this argument. I'm not now going into that, but Havel basically doesn't fit either of those camps. And I will simply read you his definition of what he says European values. I mean, I have several quotes, but I will not inflict all of them on you. Am I running after? Yeah,
2 more minutes.
Okay, so in telegraphic style. The basic set of European values as they have been formed, blah, 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 I will skip. It consists of respect for the unique human being and for the humanity's freedom, right, and dignity, the principle of solidarity, the rule of law and equality before the law, the protection of minorities of all types, democratic institutions, the separative of legislative, executive, and judicial. So the rule of law is there if you really want to hear it. Pluralist political system, private ownership, the furtherance of civil society. The present shape of these values mirrors the countless modern European experiences, including the fact that our continent has now become an important multicultural crossroads. So this is already a much richer definition, one that suggests that these values do not come from a law textbook, a legal textbook, but that they are the product of our history, of a European civilization. Havel is not ashamed of using the word European civilization as something which he doesn't qualify as being superior to other civilizations. He has very critical things to say about the way Europe has exported its values in the past. But I think that his definition, which sees Europe as today's Europe, the European Union, as having inherited that legacy, that civilizational legacy on which, and the values on which, of course, the legal principles, institutions, etc., are being based. I have run out of time, and I therefore must skip a number of things. I will simply say last word about what I wanted to say about the European Political Community meeting, which took place in Prague, because I was present at another meeting 30 years ago, which also a French president with Václav Havel organized in Prague. And that was a flop. That didn't work out for essentially 2 reasons. I mean, first of all, confederation, that was Mitterrand saying in New York speech. Well, that was a powerful statement. Europe needs a confederation. This is the first statement that addresses the new situation in Eastern Europe. Great. And then, as the partnership with Havel unfolds and the preparation for the meeting, 2 problems arise, and they lead to the what I call the flop. One is, what should we do about Russia? and Mitterrand said, well, we must not do anything that would undermine the power of Gorbachev. And I would say, well, you know, how do you make a confederation with an empire which is in the midst of breaking up? Not easy. So that was one reason. Second reason, it appeared clearly in Mitterrand's thinking that the confederation was actually to be a substitute for enlargement. And that was a second snag, and therefore it had no future. Okay, I was there and I witnessed, okay, I will skip the reasons why it fell in detail. Fast forward 30 years, we are now also in Prague, French president's initiative, Czech presidency of the European Union. We have a Czech prime minister today, a piece in the Financial Times about the confederation. And we have there...
Community.
Yeah.
Community, not confederation.
Community, sorry. European political community. And why this time is different. And I will stop there, I'm sorry. first time, this is not with Russia or this is against Russia. I mean, if you look at who's there and who's not there, well, there is no Russia and Belarus, basically. So if you want to a quick definition about who is there, it's basically the whole of Europe without Russia, okay? So it's, call it whatever you want. And so, and second reason, this is not a substitute for enlargement. In fact, this coincides with giving Ukraine a candidate status for membership in the EU. And the only way, actually, to make that plausible is to make the enlargement to the Balkans move forward. So this time, I'm not saying this is going to be a great success story, but what you have is the two main reasons for which the initial Confederation Mitterrand style 30 years ago failed. These two reasons have been addressed, and this European political community is some kind of geopolitical definition or geopolitical framework within which the enlargement of the European Union in the future can take place. This is an entire novelty. Europe is not just about legal norms and values, it is also about a geopolitical definition of its purpose.
Thank you very much. So now it's time for debate, Q&A. So what I suggest, ce que je suggère, c'est que vous puissiez poser vos questions dans les deux langues, le français et l'anglais. Si c'est en français, je traduirai pour Monsieur Jantowski. Donc ne vous sentez pas, comment dirais-je, contraint par la langue. Hein. Si vous préférez parler le français, faites-le. Voilà. Donc j'ouvre le débat et je propose qu'on prenne trois premières questions. Je vois un bras qui se lève. Oui, Emilia, une question de la Lituanie.
Yes, Emilia Ponziute-Gallois. I am Lithuanian, a researcher here. So I am part of the Visegrad group oriented towards the north. Thank you very much for this very inspiring conversation. I have a question precisely on the European political community. Thank you for reminding us the history. And I'm wondering, you know, this time it happens in Prague again. And I'm wondering if this is not an institution which suffers from excessive politeness. I'm wondering how much the Czech do believe in this initiative. And another question which is related, in France we're speaking already about the political center moving towards the Europe's east. I'm wondering how much the Czech people believe that it is actually happening.
Thank you. We are taking maybe a second question. Who? Yes, is there any other question in the back? Une autre question? Bon, alors, okay. You're going to answer this one. Okay, Michal.
Okay, I'm very grateful for the two questions. On the first one, but it will be no surprise for Jacques because we have already been discussing it a little. I am not as optimistic about the prospects of the European political community as he seems to be suggesting, and for several reasons. First of all, I was like Jacques, I was there in 1991 when the conference with Mitterrand on European Confederation was taking place in Prague, and I was also co-organizing it, and I was in charge of the media outlet and spin. And this may be, but I think 30 years later it may not be so scandalous. It may be a revelation, but already before the conference started, we were not certain that this idea would fly. and for several reasons. There was a theory, political theory, behind the confederation idea, or les assises, as it was called then. And the theory was a theory of concentric circles, in which the core was the European Union, with its own core in Paris, I suppose, and it was surrounded by the larger circles of countries that have a more or less firm affiliation towards the European Union. And in his speech during the conference, Mitterrand said literally that, you know, for some countries there's no telling whether and when in the future they can join.
Tens and tens of years, he said.
Yes. He said decades. Yeah, you're right. He said decades, perhaps longer. Yeah,
that was the words.
That was the words. And we did not think that would please some of our friends in the Balkans, and even in the Baltic countries at that time, and as much as we liked François Mitterrand personally, we did not do much to help him. Even Havel did not do much to help him. Yeah, and why am I saying this? The language behind the European political community that Macron used before the conference is very similar. Yeah, and the line about countries having to wait maybe decades, he repeated verbatim, word for word. So it certainly is a politically positive idea, because it will encourage, you know, new potential candidates to think about getting closer. But I don't think it will get them there, and I don't think it's designed to get them there. So this is my uncertainty about the European political community. On the second question about the center of gravity, as it's put, shifting east, I think the jury is out on that, but it is definitely a possibility, especially if and when Ukraine becomes part of the integration process. You know, it will not be overnight, but and by the way, the candidate status was already offered to it before the Prague summit, before the European. Yeah,
2 weeks before.
Yeah, it preceded that. So, you know, Ukraine is a country of 43 million people. It would certainly change the geopolitics and the demographics of Europe, but perhaps more geopolitics than the demographics. And this brings me to what I wanted to say, and this is another area where Jacques and I may differ slightly, about the meaning of Central European integration. You know, the Visegrad concept dates back to, I think, 1335, when there was a meeting in a place called Visegrad, and that's why we signed it there. I was there with Havel. There was an agreement between the King of Poland, the King of Hungary, and the King of Bohemia, who, by the way, was not much of a Czech, but a Luxembourg, John the Blind, who was killed at the Battle of Crécy. And And they met and agreed on a cooperation to protect themselves from whom? From the Habsburgs. You know, the Habsburgs and the growing German influence in Central and Eastern Europe was a matter of concern for these three rulers, and so they came up with this idea of cooperation. So, you know, for me, Visegrad is very little about Orban, and I don't even want to waste too much time on Orban. I think Orban will be history, hopefully soon, and Hungary will still be Hungary, and Poland will still be Poland. But there is a deeper trait or aspect of Central European identity that goes back centuries, and that went through various variations within the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, and so on and so forth. And that has, and this is what interested Havel about it enormously, that has a deep intellectual content. You know, the idea of Central Europe as a seed of cultural thoughts and ideas that you find in Kundera, that you find in Havel, that you find in Czesław Milosz, that you find in Georgi Konrad. And this, the idea of Central Europe, is different from the idea of Mitteleuropa, which is the German version of Central European perspective. And it is, I think, important regardless of the current political realities, which are not very encouraging. I agree with that. And the last sentence on this, you know, one demonstration of the fact that such an identity for all the problems still exists was when the Czech Prime Minister Fiala and the Polish Prime Minister and the Slovenian President were the first international statesmen to take the trip to Kiev and to be there with Zelensky to stand up for Ukraine, etc., etc. No other European statesman was willing to do that at that time, and I think it has to be recognized and credited. Thank you.
Yes, no other European statesman, especially not Viktor Orban. No. So, yes, the definitions, I agree that the definition of Central Europe, including for Havel, was not limited to Visegrad. The way he formulated this attempt to coordinate the efforts of these countries coming out of the Soviet fold and trying to embark on a democratic transformation and European integration, that was an agenda for Central Europe, and he was trying to give it some common ground, let's say. But obviously it has deeper historical roots. Indeed, at that meeting in Litomyšl in '94, where he asked me to chair the debate among the Central European presidents, I started the discussion by asking each of them to define Central Europe. And I gave as a warning to the Hungarian President Arpad Göncz, you know, this is what I will be asking in the debate, because he asked me, etc. So I tell him, and he gave me as a reply, oh, for me, Central Europe is where East and West meet without neutralizing each other. Wow. I said, oh, this is an interesting definition. Great, that would be a great opening line for the discussion. But I'm told by protocol that the oldest among the presidents was Weizsäcker. And so I go to ask von Weizsäcker, say, do you mind if it's Arpad Göncz starting the discussion? So, no, of course not. Let Arpad speak first. Then we start the debate, light turns on, and I ask Arpad Göncz, what is Central Europe for you? Oh, Central Europe, it's an extremely complicated question. you know, on one hand, on the other hand, and, you know, frankly, difficult to tell. And so it went complete disaster. Weizsäcker was looking at me saying, you know, Rupnik just asked me to give the floor to this guy. So I asked Weizsäcker, is Central Europe for you Mitteleuropa? Just as since Michael just mentioned, is it Mitteleuropa? No. Central Europe is not Mitteleuropa, because that, of course, he understood means German sphere of influence. No. We should call it Central-Europa. And Germany has its role and partnership, can be a partner, etc. And anyway. Each country has its own definition. Václav Havel has its definition. For him, indeed, as Michal just said, the cultural background was at least as important as the political project for the future. That is absolutely clear. But he also was aware that everybody had their own definition. For the Poles, Central Europe is the whole space between Germany and Russia. And it includes Ukraine. For the Hungarians, it's the Danubian space. What is the Danubian space? Well, it's wherever you have Hungarian minorities, more or less. You know, the Czech definition actually turns out to be much more of a Habsburg definition, because when the Czech talk about Central Europe, they both these things. Anyway, each country of Central Europe has its definition. And it's the political project that matters today, and that's what's been dividing them recently.
We take another question, please.
Je vais me permettre de poser la question en français, ce sera plus court. Éric Pestel, je voudrais quand même revenir sur cette notion du groupe de Visegrad, parce que j'ai un peu senti que vous avez quand même peut-être une analyse différente. Monsieur Rupnik a parlé d'implosion du groupe de Visegrad. Vous avez insisté sur les racines historiques de ce groupe. Est-ce que vous pensez néanmoins que cette coalition, alors au-delà des gouvernants hongrois et polonais qui effectivement changeront probablement, est-ce que vous pensez que ça a une réalité dans l'avenir? Et est-ce que, au contraire, avec une maturation de plus en plus grande dans l'Europe, on ne va pas arriver à des coalitions plutôt thématiques, à géométrie variable? Je ne parle pas de structure ou d'institution, mais véritablement de partenariat. Ou est-ce que vous pensez qu'il y a vraiment une réalité d'un partenariat sur tous les thèmes liés aux pays qui font partie du groupe Visegrad?
Do you think that this kind of regional structure has a future, or what about moving towards more thematical coalitions in the future? You know, which means sort of variable geometry building or construction, which goes against the idea that you just have a regional setting for dealing with everything, right?
I understand the question, and I am I'm afraid a bit of conservative on that question. I believe that history matters. I believe that geography matters. Geography is destiny, and I think the best illustration why, for better or worse, the Visegrad group is still around, and this hexagonale or the pentagonale, I think it still exists, actually, but you never hear about it. And you know, the problem with international institutions, you have to be very careful, is they cannot be they cannot be cancelled. You know, they are there forever without doing anything. So it's still there, but it's not important because there is no deeper underlying affinity between any two or any three of these countries than between those countries and any other European countries. You know, Whereas this is real, in the same way as the Baltic regional cooperation is real, because again it's based on centuries of exchange and culture and wars and all kinds of things. The Benelux is a natural cooperation area without even thinking much about it. Yeah.
What about the Franco-German relation?
The Franco-German is a work in progress, because of course historically it's gone through so many twists and turns, and like the British-French relationship that I'm more familiar with, it's a complicated history. Yeah. And our history is also complicated, but somehow it works. But not all parts of it work. At this moment, the political cooperation does not work inside the Visegrad Group very much, because nobody wants to support Orban, and Orban does not want to have much to do with the more pro-European parts of the cooperation. It works best, not surprisingly, in the cultural area. I mean, there is a thing called the Visegrad Fund, which funds all kinds of cultural projects, cross-border projects, publications, etc. It works irrespective of Orban or Kaczynski or anyone else. It's funded, and that is a great thing. And the last thing I will say on this is, it's not like, we are the model pupils of the Visegrad cooperation, and the Hungarians are the bad boys of the Visegrad cooperation. Over the 30 years, this role has changed, and there was always one country which was the model student, and one country which was the bad pupil. And during the early 1990s, it was Slovakia with Mečiar. We didn't want to cooperate with Mečiar. Then Klaus had his own ideas, and he didn't have much time for Visegrad cooperation. It was, it was holding us back, and we were the best anyway. So etc. etc. Yeah. And then all of a sudden, the Poles became the model students in the regional cooperation, and now look where the Poles are, So, it's hubris in politics that brings you down, and it's the ephemeral perspectives that one should be careful about, because in 10 years' time everything may be different.
Yes, but it seems to be very important for the West to have this kind of assessment, to have the bad boys and the good boys, right? It's constructed by the West. The Musterknabe, as the Germans said, and the Sorgenkind, right?
Yeah. Well, that's the language. Right.
Jacques, would you like to say?
Well, perhaps I would
Je me permets quand même
something.
d'ajouter une chose sur le Visegrad 4. Ce sont des présidences d'un an. En ce moment, c'est la Slovaquie. À partir de juillet 2023, ça va être la République tchèque. Donc, messieurs, mettons-nous d'accord. On en discutera en juillet prochain.
His French is too good for me.
Non, moi je pense.
Just remind the presidencies that it's a Slovak presidency and
I know.
a Czech presidency.
No. Czech presidency, and Slovak presidency, that will be the easy part. The more difficult, the two countries that were closest were Poland and Hungary, okay? Kaczynski and Orban. They met in Krynica in 2016 and said, what we want to do together is to bring counter-revolution in Europe. This is their word, this is a quote, okay? Krynica, October 2016, counter-revolution in Europe. Well, today they are at opposite poles over the war in Ukraine. So, yeah, swings and roundabouts. They are both are conservative, and they belong to the. When I talked about the European values, they belong to that second group: the family, the church, the nation, as distant from Europe as possible. What I think, I mean, it has been asked about the geopolitical center of gravity. Well, that has been something that question has been around basically since 1989. If you no longer have a divided Europe, the European Union as such is confronted with what will happen in the space eastward. And what you have basically, and the Ukrainian war now simply extends it further, is geopolitics move eastwards, institution moves westwards, because the anchor of the institutional anchor for that new architecture is in the West, it's in the European Union. And that is not going to move. And if it were going to move, that may be a problem, because you say Europe has difficult time functioning at 27. And now you tell us, or you think it's going to be better at 37? Well, if you believe that, you believe anything. So even an extended Europe, an enlarged Europe, of which I am an advocate, and I've been a supporter of needs to have a political core. You cannot imagine an entity of 37 countries working smoothly, etc. It will have to change its internal modus operandi. You will not have enlarged. Okay, this is my conviction. You will not have an enlargement to 37 unless you modify some of the rules of the game, including voting procedures, etc. Here is the expert on the voting procedure. If you have questions, you ask him after.
Okay, but tonight I am the moderator. Maybe two last questions before we close the debate, and we start with Alain Soubigou and then Nathalie Nougat.
Děkuji, merci, thank you. Alain Soubigou, la Sorbonne Paris 1. Quand on parle de la dimension philosophique de la pensée européenne de Václav Havel, on ne peut revenir qu'à Jan Patočka. Et quand on parle de Jan Patočka, avec toute la dimension de la crise, on remonte encore un tout petit peu plus loin. Jan Patočka discute les théories de Masaryk. J'aimerais enrichir, s'il est possible, la longue liste qui commence à Clausewitz et se poursuit, proposée par son Excellence Fleischmann. Masaryk écrit deux textes très importants là-dessus. C'est d'abord en 1913, Russland und Europa, Ruskoa Evropa, dans lequel... Je traduirai en tchèque après, peut-être.
Non, mais on peut le faire simultanément.
Mr. Soubigou is stressing the affiliation between Havel, Patočka, and Thomas Garrigue Masaryk. And Thomas Garrigue Masaryk wrote important texts, one in 1913, called in German
Russland und Europa, Ruskoa Evropa. Et dans ce livre, j'ai honte, hein, un livre de 800 pages, je le résume en une phrase. Masaryk opère, vous savez, les philosophes, ils ne sont pas dans la logique d'union, de communauté, ils sont dans la délimitation, la précision de la définition. Et Masaryk, après avoir lu tous les grands auteurs russes, avoir rencontré Gorky, avoir rencontré Tolstoï, il arrive à cette définition un petit peu nette, hein, je suis désolé de cette netteté, mais en gros, l'Europe, c'est la rationalité, et la Russie, pour encore longtemps, c'est le mysticisme. Bon. Est-ce que nous sommes sortis de cette distinction rationalité-mysticisme? Est-ce que dans la grande Europe à 44 pays, la Russie post-mystique peut venir? Il y a un deuxième texte que Jacques Rupnik connaît bien, puisque nous l'avons republié il y a 20 ans, c'est
et que j'ai eu l'honneur de le préfacer.
Nova Evropa, la Nouvelle Europe, et dans lequel il déplace à nouveau son jeu de définition, et il précise un tout petit peu, avec, entre les deux, entre le livre de 1913 et celui qu'il écrit en 1918, 12 millions de morts. Ça amène à réfléchir un petit peu autrement. Et il distingue le match en disant cette grande guerre que tout le monde croit inutile, une boucherie insensée, etc., elle a un sens. C'est le grand match que vous résumez fort bien dans votre introduction, le grand match entre la démocratie d'un côté, la théocratie de l'autre. Donc, ce sont des modalités de la définition de 1913, rationalisme contre mysticisme, démocratie contre théocratie. Est-ce qu'on est sorti de ce match? Est-ce que la Russie est sortie de ce match? Est-ce que la délimitation de l'Europe peut faire l'économie de ces définitions un petit peu rudes? Et je suis heureux de verser le nom de Thomas Masaryk dans la discussion parce que c'est du solide.
Thank you very much. Okay, go ahead, maybe.
Yeah. Well, I will try to be short. You know, Masaryk was a great systematician of in the 19th century tradition, and in doing so, he sometimes simplified matters, including in his book on Russia and Europe. First of all, you know, I'm sorry, but after 50 million dead people in the Second World War, you know, we are not entitled to speak of ourselves as a rational continent. You know, we are as much a potential subject to waves of irrationalism, populism, fascism, and the current events are, you know, there are some signs of that in the current event. The second thing, which is equally obvious, is that there are great intellectuals in the Russian tradition of a non-mystical type, you know, Herzen, Turgenev, you know, others. The problem is that there are so few of them that the Oriental despotic mystic mentality always prevails as it is prevailing today. So I, you know, in terms of practical policy, I think we need to work to support the ideas of rationality in our Russian friends that we're still communicating with, and we have to fight against the ideas of irrationality that threaten us from the inside.
Thank you very much. Nathalie Nogared.
While Nathalie is getting ready, I would just add to the idea, the title of Masaryk's book, Russland und Europa, suggests that he's talking about two different entities. And his insight into Russia is very much through literature. He's read everything. He's read Dostoevsky. He's read, but not only, of course, he knows the history well. What is interesting is that this perception has been revived or vindicated today. You know, when Kundera wrote his essay, Central Europe as a Kidnapped West, he received thousands and thousands of pages criticizing him for expelling Russia from Europe. He said, I never expelled anything. I simply said, it is another civilization. Another civilization. And I think that some of those insights from Masaryk and others, including Kundera's, have been vindicated. And then, of course, on your, well, I could say things about the second, but I won't because I wrote the preface to that book, so those who are interested will read the preface. Yeah.
Thank you very much for this very important discussion. I think the theme is very important, the legacy of Václav Havel and how we think about Europe. And I think having this discussion now when there's war on the continent is absolutely fundamental. And I think it's probably a conversation that we're only really starting, I think, because war is the single most important defining feature right now in Europe. And so my question is, the title is Europe as seen from the center, and my question, to try to keep it short, has to do with Europe and the transatlantic link as seen from the center. And I would argue that in this country, in France, we are not taught, and maybe I will be, maybe I will get some pushback from teachers here or professors, but my experience is we are not taught in France as students, as school children or lycée, high school children. We are not taught that the European construct was made possible by American engagement on the continent. The European construct was made possible because there was the Cold War, and the United States needed to consolidate, stabilize democracy in Western Europe after the absolute disaster of the two world wars. And we had the European construct with that background. Fast forward to today, I believe that European unity, maybe you will disagree, I believe the European unity that we see, the relative unity we see today in the face of war, is possible thanks to US renewed engagement in Europe. Diplomatic deliveries of weapons, support to the Ukrainians, and the push, the diplomatic and political push for Europeans to rally around this policy of support to Ukrainians. I believe without the US role, this would not be happening in this way. And certainly we know that 70 to 80% of the support to Ukrainians is coming from the US. So my question is, looking at this picture today, what do you think Václav Havel's assessment or outlook on this particular situation of a transatlantic link apparently renewed, but also we know it's different from when the Yugoslav war happened, right? In the early 90s, there was no doubt that US engagement in Europe would last. Today, it's a big question mark. So what would you think, how would you guess that Havel would see this transatlantic equation today? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Can I add something to that? Because
Please.
You said that you have a responsibility in designing the slogan "Return to Europe," and I have the impression that "Return to Europe" meant for Havel more return to the West than to Europe, right? So including Europe plus the US, and that has always been a controversy with the French conception, right, where we separate the United States from Europe in our conception of the world. So, would you say yes? Strategic autonomy, etc., etc. Well, it's a continuity, right, from the Gaullist period onwards, and Mr. Macron is not renewing anything. He is in the continuity, right? What about? Well, I know about the Czech perception, but I'm asking you, what about the Czech view of on that?
Well, first of all, nobody knows what the Back to Europe slogan was supposed to mean, because it was completely spontaneous. It was something that you had on the streets. It was not something that Havel or anybody else, invented. People, screamed back to Europe, and I don't want to parse it too much, but I think that what they meant was back to who we are. It's because in our minds there was never a question that we were expelled from Europe or that we were not Europeans anymore. We were, Europeans waiting for an opportunity, and the opportunity came, so we said back to Europe. I won't say more about that, but I will say of course, I realize that it's a different perception in this country, but even here, you know, if it were not for French support, the United States would never exist, probably. Yeah, and so you have a responsibility, you have a role, you cannot deny it, you know, and and for us it's a no-brainer because you know it's. I count already 4 or 5 times in the last 100 years or so that at critical moments the United States came to the rescue of Europe. You know, Czechoslovakia would never existed if it were not for Woodrow Wilson and the 14 points at the end of the First World War. The Second World War might end up differently if it were not for the American involvement and for the American liberation of parts of what was then Czechoslovakia, today the Czech Republic. Of course, the United States were instrumental in winning the Cold War. I mean, they were not alone. I mean, we had plenty of support from French intellectuals, less so from the French government. But even with the American government, the support varied over the years. But that in 1989 it came to the end of the Cold War and reunification of Europe. Can you imagine it without the United States playing a role? I can't. I already spoke about the war in former Yugoslavia. Again, the involvement was decisive. Then, and the most current situation, let's be frank, if the Biden administration did not take a tough line, and I was a bit surprised by how clearly and effectively they responded. You know, today we in Europe might be in a whole lot of trouble because in the beginning there was no one else who was, you know, standing up and waving the flag. You know, it was the Americans again, and not to mention the material scope of the support, etc., etc. It may not sound easy to French ears, but if you look at the map, at the end of the day, Europe is a very small promontory at the end of a very large Eurasian continent without the strategic depth that the alliance with North America offers us, you know, and without a military might. I think we could, you know, develop theoretical arguments whether we would last 2 years or 5 years or 10 years, but not much more than that. Yeah. So let's not kid ourselves.
Personally, I totally agree with you, except one thing is that the Americans are able to elect people like Mr. Trump, right? Which could be a problem for us.
That's the ephemeral perspective again, you know. De Gaulle, he was a fantastic man. He took France out of the military structures of the North Atlantic Alliance, you know. Chirac brought them back? Yeah, I think it was Chirac. Trump lasted 4 years. There are more dangerous things than Trump, and that is the mentality, the political mentality and the political forces that invented Trump. Yeah, that made him the monster he became. Now, luckily, he's gone. I hope he will never come back. But yes, it's a problem. But it's a 4-year problem. You know, it's not a century-long problem.
Jacques.
Well, no, I agree with practically everything that has been said. I would simply add on this last point that the European strategic autonomy has, as I understand it, has no chance whatsoever to be accepted by Europeans, that concept, if it is understood or presented or conceived as something that would be against the transatlantic bond. If that were the starting point, it's a non-starter. Okay, so, and everybody knows that, including Mr. Macron. However, the Trump experience and the underlying currents that you mentioned, which entail a lot of disengagement from the world, disengagement from international commitments, disengagement from international governance. It can be on the climate, it can be in all sorts of things. Basically, the isolationist streak that is there, that nationalist isolationist streak that is there behind the Trump phenomenon, and it can be in different guise next time, is an encouragement for Europeans to think that there will not always be somebody who will fix the things for us. You know, and one conclusion from what you presented, and I agree that this has been often the case, we don't have to worry because at the end of the day, somebody will fix it, and that somebody is the United States. I think we can no longer say that, and that is an invitation, let's say, for Europeans to think on their own feet, not against the transatlantic bond, but to make sure, precisely, to be a convincing partner for the Americans. Because the one thing the Americans have constantly been saying is that we have other commitments. You know, the pivot to Asia has not been invented by Biden or by Trump. It was there, and all of them are thinking of the agenda of the 21st century, which is in Asia, and somehow Putin has managed to bring back the Americans into Europe. So, in a way, reassuring in some respects for the traditional Atlanticists that some of us are, but that is not a completely reassuring thought. And the final word, the idea that Europe is a mere peninsula extension at the end of the Eurasian continent, that's Paul Valéry. And he was a poet, but also a very clear thinker. And his thinking about Europe deserves revisiting. We have been revisiting Havel. Well, Paul Valéry could be a good companion volume to Havel.
Yeah, one sentence, it seems, I agree, it seems that it takes a Hitler or a Milosevic or a Putin to always, make Americans focus on Europe and bring them back, and for better or worse, we seem to have no shortage of those characters.
That's the word of the end. Thank you so much for